History remembers Alexander the Great as a brilliant tactician, a golden boy of conquest, crowned with laurels and myths. But behind the marble statues and textbook glory lies a darker truth, soaked in blood and built on terror. His name did not echo across continents because of kindness or strategy alone. It echoed because people were too afraid to forget it. In 332 BCE, the island fortress of Tyre dared to resist him. For 7 grueling months, Alexander laid siege to the city, determined to make an example so terrifying that no other city would ever dream of defiance. And when Tyre finally fell, he didn't just conquer it, he crucified it. 2,000 men were nailed to crosses along the coastline, their bodies hung like grotesque flags fluttering in the Mediterranean sun. This was not revenge, it was a message written in torn flesh and splintered bone. But the horror didn't end there. 30,000 civilians, men, women, and children, were chained and sold into slavery. Survivors were paraded as trophies. Defenders were dragged to the harbors and thrown into the sea, still alive, to rot beneath the waves. The salt water was no longer blue, it was red, clouded by the screams of the drowning. And in perhaps the most haunting act of all, children were forced to march with Alexander's army, used as living shields, little hands trembling in front of blades. For the defiant leaders of Tyre, he reserved a theatrical finale. Temples crumbled upon them, not in worship, but in death, mocking the gods who could not protect them. This was not just conquest. This was calculated terror, and it worked. If you're ready to face history's darkest truths, drop "I'm ready" in the comments. Like, subscribe. This is just the beginning. The destruction of Carthage during the Third Punic War was not just a military conquest, it was a carefully planned extermination of an entire people, culture, and memory. Rome did not merely aim to defeat Carthage, it sought to erase it from the world. The brutality of this mission unfolded in layers so shocking that they echo as early forms of genocide. What took place was more than war, it was calculated erasure. Inside the heart of the fallen city, Roman soldiers claimed they found fires still burning in the Temple of Tanit. These flames were not from the battle, but from rituals, sacrifices. Some Roman accounts, likely exaggerated for propaganda, told of children being burned alive by Carthaginians as offerings. Whether fully true or not, these stories became powerful tools. They painted Carthage as a place of monstrous traditions, justifying the Roman slaughter not only as war, but as a moral duty. The horror of those stories lingered far beyond the ruins, fusing myth with atrocity to serve Roman politics. Captured Carthaginian leaders didn't face simple execution. Many were subjected to death by boiling tar, dipped alive into thick, burning pitch. This was not only to kill them, but to mock what Romans considered their slippery, cunning diplomacy. It was a brutal message to any future rival who might try to use strategy or negotiation against Rome. Death became a spectacle, pain drawn out as public theater. The streets of Carthage, once full of trade and life, became hunting grounds. As Roman forces advanced, thousands of civilians tried to escape underground, hiding in sewers. But even here, the Romans showed no mercy. They sealed the exits, poured fire and debris into the tunnels, and left the people inside to suffocate or burn. The sewers became mass graves, transformed by fire and ash into tombs for the desperate and the innocent. When the killing was done and Carthage was reduced to rubble, the Romans went a step further. In a symbolic act of eternal damnation, priests walked the ruins, carrying salt. They poured it into the soil, reciting curses as they went. This was not just a military or environmental tactic, it was spiritual. It meant no crops would grow again. The land itself was cursed, its future deliberately poisoned. The Romans wanted the memory of Carthage to die. Not just the people, but the very soil on which they had built their lives. Finally, to make sure the cultural memory couldn't survive in word or song, the Romans banned the Punic language. This was not just censorship, it was linguicide, the deliberate murder of a tongue. Without a language, a culture cannot tell its stories. Children grow up unable to understand the words of their ancestors. Carthage was not only physically destroyed, but made linguistically invisible. The voice of an entire civilization was silenced, intentionally and officially, by law. Each of these acts, whether brutal execution, sacred desecration, or forced silence, was part of a single, grim objective: to make Carthage not just fall, but vanish. Not just to win a war, but to make it so the world would one day forget there had ever been a Carthage at all. The plan nearly worked. The Assyrian Empire did not merely punish its enemies, it ritualized pain into a public performance, transforming brutality into a sanctioned, almost sacred form of control. In Assyria, violence wasn't random or chaotic. It was codified, precise, and deeply symbolic. Cities conquered by Assyrian armies didn't just fall, they became stages upon which suffering was choreographed to deliver a message: obedience or obliteration. One of the most feared punishments was flaying alive. This wasn't done in secret dungeons or behind palace walls. It happened in broad daylight, in the heart of crowded public squares. Political rebels, regional leaders who resisted, or even governors suspected of betrayal were seized, stripped, and their skin carefully peeled from their bodies while they still breathed. The skin was then nailed to city gates or palace walls, left to dry in the sun, an eternal warning to those who might challenge Assyrian rule. The act was both execution and exhibition, meant not only to kill the body, but to leave behind a permanent message written in flesh. For those whose weapon was not steel but speech, the Assyrians reserved a different kind of horror. Critics, prophets, or public speakers who dared question the king were silenced literally. Their tongues were cut out, not with quick efficiency, but with deliberate cruelty. These organs, symbols of disobedience and dissent, were preserved in glass jars and placed near palaces or temples. Visitors and locals alike would see them, an unmistakable reminder that even a word spoken against the empire could lead to lifelong silence. For rebels or insurgents who fought back militarily, the punishment often didn't end with capture. In some cases, they were thrown into dry wells or deep pits, only these weren't empty. At the bottom waited scorpions, bred and gathered specifically for this purpose. Victims were left to suffer slowly, their screams muffled by the earth above, their skin burning from venom, their minds broken by the knowledge that death could take hours, even days. It wasn't just execution, it was erasure, buried alive among poison and darkness. Even for those not executed, the Assyrians ensured submission was forever etched into their bodies. Captured soldiers, citizens, or even children of defeated cities were marked with tattoos, not decorative, but degrading. These tattoos often included words like slave, dog, or religious symbols identifying them as property of Assur, the Assyrian god of war and dominion. These markings were usually placed on visible parts of the body, forehead, neck, or hands, making sure that shame could never be hidden. Their bodies became permanent announcements of defeat, reminders to all who saw them that resistance was not just futile, it was branding. But perhaps the most disturbing display of all was something the Assyrians called divine protection, the construction of the so-called Wall of Eyes. After major battles, captured enemy soldiers, especially archers and officers, were blinded, their eyes carefully gouged out. These bloody orbs were not discarded, but collected and pressed into wet clay that would dry into hardened murals. These grotesque mosaics were then embedded into city walls, temples, and gates. The Assyrians believed these eyes served a magical function, warding off enemy spirits and protecting the city through the terror they inspired. It was spiritual warfare built from human remains. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was governance through horror. Every act, every punishment was meant to reinforce a single truth. The Assyrian Empire ruled not just with might, but with fear so deep it reached into religion, memory, and the body itself. There was no corner of life untouched by the message: the empire sees, hears, and never forgets. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors didn't conquer with sheer force alone. It ruled through fear, engineered terror, and turned massacre into a deliberate, strategic art. The city of Merv stands as one of the most harrowing examples of this. When the Mongols laid siege to the city in 1221, they didn't simply win, they obliterated. After Merv surrendered, each Mongol soldier was assigned a quota to kill a certain number of people, often dozens, sometimes hundreds. If a soldier failed to meet his death count, he too would be executed. According to some chroniclers of the time, nearly 700,000 people were killed. This wasn't chaos. It was execution on an industrial scale, systematized slaughter where lives were reduced to numbers and quotas. Men, women, and children were dragged out, lined up, and beheaded one by one. The city was left silent, buried in the weight of its dead, its name transformed into a whispered lesson for any who might dare resist. But the Mongols didn't stop with the sword. Their warfare seeped into every layer of survival. After they captured a city, they often poisoned the water wells by dumping in the rotting corpses of the slain. These weren't accidental contaminations. It was methodical. By turning fresh water into foul death traps, the Mongols ensured no one could re-inhabit the area. Survivors who fled or tried to return would find only stench, sickness, and disease. In the desert regions where water was life, this was slow extermination. The earth itself became inhospitable. The Mongols had no interest in reclaiming the land. They wanted it haunted, remembered, avoided. Water was turned against the people, made into a final weapon long after the last sword was sheathed. When it came to dealing with royalty or nobility, the Mongols displayed a cruel genius wrapped in ritual. They believed that royal blood should not be spilled onto the ground. It was sacred, tied to the heavens. But this belief did not save kings and rulers. It only changed the way they died. Captured nobles were often executed by being crushed under heavy wooden doors or massive stone gates. Their bodies were laid out. The great weight dropped upon them slowly, breaking bones and suffocating life in a way that avoided bloodshed. It was execution by compression, slow and deliberate. This way, Mongol leaders could claim to honor traditions while still eliminating every rival. The message was clear: even your gods and customs can't protect you. The crushing wasn't just physical, it was symbolic, reducing entire dynasties to silence beneath the weight of Mongol domination. Psychological warfare was one of the Mongols' deadliest tools, and they wielded it with chilling precision. Before attacking a city, they often sent letters ahead, notes written or signed in blood, carried by trembling messengers. These letters promised annihilation in vivid terms. Men burned alive, children trampled under horses, entire bloodlines erased. Some were accompanied by mutilated survivors from previous cities, left alive only to tell the tale. These written threats weren't empty, they were previews. Many towns, upon receiving such letters, opened their gates in terror, surrendering without a fight. The Mongols understood something that modern military commanders would study centuries later. Fear, properly administered, can conquer faster than any army. And when the killing was done, when the fires burned out and the last screams faded, the Mongols left behind more than ashes. In place of cities, they built monuments, not of stone or gold, but of human skulls. These were not random heaps. The skulls were carefully arranged in massive pyramids, often sorted by age and gender, men here, women there, children stacked separately. These grotesque sculptures were meant to be seen from miles away, their white bone glinting in the sun. They were memorials of terror, permanent reminders that this place had once defied the Khan. The pyramids didn't just tell a story, they screamed it. They stood for decades in some places, long after the Mongols had moved on, silently retelling the fate of resistance. The Viking raids across Europe were not just violent. They were crafted acts of psychological warfare, terror wrapped in ritual, and destruction used to rewrite power. One of the most disturbing and debated acts linked to Viking cruelty is the blood eagle ritual. Though its historical accuracy is debated by scholars, its presence in the sagas shows how deeply rooted this image of terror was. According to the accounts, the blood eagle was performed by cutting open a victim's back, cracking the ribs outward like wings and pulling the lungs out while the person was still alive. This wasn't just execution, it was theater. The act was done slowly, deliberately, and often publicly. It was meant to humiliate and terrorize enemies, to say, "This is what happens to those who defy us." Whether it was truly practiced or just mythologized over time, the sheer idea of it was enough to spread fear faster than ships could sail. Religion offered no protection when the Vikings came ashore. In fact, places of worship were often their first targets. Monasteries filled with gold, art, and religious relics were easy to raid and mostly undefended. But what made these attacks especially shocking was what happened to the people inside. Monks, men devoted to peace and prayer, were dragged from their altars and beheaded where they knelt. Their blood stained the sacred floors they had just cleaned for worship. This was no random act of violence. It was a clear message. Even your God cannot protect you. Killing priests in the very place they prayed was not just physical destruction. It was spiritual domination. It made people question their faith. If a God cannot save his own holy men, what hope is there for the rest? The treatment of women during Viking raids reveals a different but equally dark layer of brutality. Captured women were not just enslaved or used for labor, they were forced into roles both intimate and strategic. Some were taken as wives, used to produce children that would carry Viking blood into conquered lands. But worse still, these women were sometimes forced to walk at the front lines of later raids, used as human shields. The logic was cold and calculated. Enemy soldiers might hesitate to strike if they saw their own wives, daughters, or neighbors being pushed ahead of the Viking line. These women were no longer seen as individuals. They became tools, weapons of emotional and physical warfare. Their lives were used to protect those who had destroyed them. Timing was another brutal weapon in the Viking playbook. Attacks weren't always random or based solely on weather or supplies. They were timed to create the most emotional damage. Raiding a village on Christmas Day or Easter Sunday wasn't coincidence. These were the holiest days in the Christian calendar, times when communities were gathered, praying, unarmed and vulnerable. Striking then caused more than just casualties, it shattered spirits. A village burned on Easter wasn't just a place lost, it felt like a god had been defeated. The emotional devastation of losing family, homes, and hope on a sacred day deepened the trauma. The Vikings knew this, and they used it to break the will of entire regions. In some of the darkest moments of these raids, captured Christian converts were subjected to what the Vikings called a mock baptism. But this ritual was no second chance at faith. It was a death sentence. Victims were dragged to rivers, forced under the cold, rushing water, and held down until they drowned. It was a cruel parody of the Christian baptism rite. Instead of rising from water into new life, they were pulled into death. This was not just killing, it was ideological warfare. The Vikings wanted to erase the power of foreign gods, not only by fire and sword, but by drowning their symbols, literally and metaphorically. Through this, they claimed dominance not only over bodies, but over beliefs. In ancient Persia, the art of punishment went beyond mere execution. It became a public performance, rich in symbolism, cruelty, and psychological impact. One of the most horrifying methods ever recorded was scaphism, sometimes known as the boats. The victim was stripped naked and tightly bound between two hollowed-out canoes or wooden shells, one on top, one below, leaving the head, hands, and feet exposed. The person was force-fed a mixture of milk and honey, which caused severe diarrhea. More honey was then smeared on their exposed flesh to attract insects. The bound body was left in a stagnant body of water or under the sun, unable to move, urinate, or protect itself. The filth and sugar drew swarms of flies, beetles, and worms which laid eggs and burrowed into the flesh. Over several days, sometimes weeks, the victim slowly rotted from the inside out, eaten alive, conscious the entire time. It was not just about killing, it was about destroying identity, stripping dignity, and sending a message to anyone watching or hearing about it. betrayal, or insult to the Persian Empire would be met with a suffering so grotesque that even death was delayed out of cruelty. The Persians also had a way of executing greed itself. In one famous punishment for corrupt officials and governors, molten gold was poured down the throats of those who had hoarded wealth or abused their power. It wasn't just about the act of killing, it was about poetic justice. The very substance they had lusted for became the tool of their destruction. This method left a brutal message behind. Those who worship wealth over loyalty would find no safety in their riches. Gold, the object of desire, became their final drink. The act was often witnessed by others, deliberately staged so that the imagery would burn into memory. Greed doesn't just corrupt the soul, it seals the mouth forever. Execution in the Persian Empire was not always confined to humans alone. Royal elephants, symbols of imperial power and divine right, were trained to execute with precision. These massive animals were taught to crush bones, gore bellies, or throw bodies with their trunks. Often, the condemned were traitors, and their executions became public displays of the Shah's authority. Crowds would gather in large arenas or palace courtyards to watch. The noise of the elephant, the screams of the condemned, and the cheering of the crowd turned the event into a living monument of fear. Using such majestic creatures for killing wasn't accidental. It fused royalty, religion, and punishment into a single unforgettable performance. To see an elephant act on the will of the king reminded all spectators that power was absolute and could strike from the throne or under its feet. The Tower of Silence was originally a sacred Zoroastrian place, used to expose dead bodies to vultures so as not to pollute the earth. But in the hands of rulers seeking vengeance, it became something else. Instead of placing corpses on the tower, they placed the living. Enemies of the state, traitors, spies, or blasphemers were taken to these high circular platforms and tied down under the sun. Vultures, thinking them dead, would begin to circle. The victims were left without food, water, or shade. Their flesh was pecked open slowly, starting with the softest parts: eyes, lips, fingers. The combination of heat, thirst, and bird attacks turned the punishment into an extended and terrifying death. The sacred became desecrated, the holy tower turned into an altar of slow execution. In another gruesome form of mockery and punishment, rebels and drunkards, especially those who had insulted royal authority while intoxicated, were drowned in oversized wine jars. These clay fermentation vessels, normally used for making and storing wine, became tombs. The victim was pushed inside and the lid sealed or held down until the body stopped moving. It was symbolic. Their betrayal, fueled by wine or arrogance, was washed away in the very drink that had encouraged their rebellion. It was a message not just of punishment, but of irony. Your disloyalty fermented your own death. The laughter of onlookers only deepened the humiliation as the image of drowning in one's own vice etched itself into communal memory. In imperial China, especially under certain dynasties where absolute power was enforced with unmatched brutality, fear was carefully cultivated as a tool of order. One of the most terrifying forms of punishment ever devised was lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts. This form of execution was not merely a method of killing, it was a psychological and spiritual assault. The condemned was tied to a wooden frame in a public space, often a busy square or market, where crowds could gather. The executioner, following a cruelly specific process, would begin slicing away the flesh, first from the limbs, then the torso, saving the face and heart for last. The cuts were made with small blades, shallow at first, to prolong the pain and delay death. It could go on for hours, and victims were often drugged to keep them conscious longer. Families were sometimes forced to watch. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was obliteration of the body, spirit, and memory. Under certain dynasties, lingqi was used for crimes like treason or parricide, where the criminal was considered to have lost all humanity. The method also denied the traditional respect of a whole body in death, which was culturally crucial in Chinese belief. The dismemberment made sure the soul would not find peace or rebirth. The state also turned its wrath on scholars, those once honored for their wisdom, when their ideas clashed with imperial control. During the rule of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, hundreds of Confucian scholars were buried alive. These were men of letters, thinkers who questioned the emperor's harsh new laws or mourned the destruction of ancient texts during the infamous book burnings. Seeing intellectuals as a threat to unity, the emperor ordered them rounded up. Deep pits were dug, and the scholars were thrown in alive, covered in earth as their screams faded. This was not just an act of execution, it was an erasure of dissenting thought. By burying them in silence, the emperor sent a clear message. Knowledge that did not serve power would be extinguished at its roots. The act left a scar on Chinese memory and illustrated how control over thought was considered just as important as control over land. In the wet seasons, some punishments were timed specifically to coincide with the rains. Prisoners were executed in open fields or along riverbanks, where monsoon rains would quickly turn soil into thick, clinging mud. Their bodies were not buried, but left exposed, sinking slowly into the wet ground. Over days, the corpses would rot in full view, returning to the earth in the most literal sense. Officials called this an offering to the earth spirits, a sacrifice that merged law and supernatural belief. But beyond ritual, it was also deeply psychological. Citizens walking by would see the bloated, half-sunken bodies, smell the decay, and feel the horror. It reminded all who passed that justice was not hidden away in private dungeons. It was present, wet, decaying, and waiting for the next offender. Some architectural projects, especially fortresses or city walls intended to suppress conquered regions, carried a curse from the start. Victims, sometimes criminals, sometimes captured enemies, were sealed alive into the very foundations of these buildings. Their bodies were placed into niches or hollow sections of the structure, then bricked over. Sometimes you could still hear the muffled screams for hours or even days after. This gruesome practice was believed to trap a spirit within the walls, dooming enemy structures with bad luck or filling imperial projects with protective spiritual energy. It fused construction with execution, and the buildings themselves became monuments to terror. Every brick reminded onlookers that the empire was built on the bodies of the crushed. In the courts of some Chinese emperors, suspected spies met their end not in secret, but in chambers of boiling oil, in full view of nobles and attendants. These massive iron cauldrons were heated until the oil bubbled violently. The accused was suspended above by ropes or platforms, then slowly lowered into the vat. The process was done gradually to extend the screams and heighten the drama. Sometimes the executioners would pause halfway, letting the legs cook before finishing the job. The sight, sound, and smell were overwhelming. For the emperor and his court, it served as a deadly spectacle, a statement that espionage would not be tolerated, not just as a crime, but as an offense against the throne's dignity. This fusion of entertainment and death turned loyalty into a theater of horror. High atop the stepped pyramids of the Aztec Empire, where blood met sky, ritual sacrifice was not only a religious duty, it was believed to be a cosmic necessity. The most sacred of these offerings involved tearing the still-beating heart from a living victim. Priests trained from youth in spiritual ceremony and physical precision would lay the victim across a stone slab atop the temple. With a ceremonial obsidian blade, sharp enough to slice through bone, they would cut open the chest in one swift motion. The heart was pulled out and lifted toward the sun as an offering to Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war. The body was often pushed down the temple steps afterward, its blood painting the stone red. To the Aztecs, this was not cruelty, it was devotion. The heart was seen as the seat of life, and offering it ensured the sun would continue to rise. Without these sacrifices, they believed the world would end in darkness. On certain holy days, the priests who conducted these sacrifices did not simply step away clean. Instead, they honored the gods further by wearing the flayed skins of the victims. The skin, removed with almost surgical precision, was draped over the priest's own body like clothing. This act had deep spiritual meaning. It symbolized rebirth and transformation, much like the seasonal cycles of nature. For days, these priests would walk through the city, blood still dripping, the skin stiffening in the sun. The people did not fear them. They revered them. This was not seen as grotesque, but as sacred. The priest became a living vessel for divine power. He had crossed into the realm of the gods and returned, wearing proof of his passage. The supply of sacrificial victims could not be left to chance. To keep the gods satisfied, the Aztecs needed a constant stream of human offerings. So, they created a special type of conflict known as the Flower Wars. Unlike typical wars fought over land or resources, these were carefully arranged battles agreed upon by both sides, often between the Aztecs and rival city-states like Tlaxcala. The goal wasn't to kill the enemy, but to capture them alive. Warriors were trained to disable rather than slay. When the battles ended, those taken prisoner were paraded back to the capital and prepared for sacrifice. These wars were as much religious rituals as they were military campaigns. They allowed the Aztec state to fulfill its spiritual duties while maintaining the skills of its warriors in controlled combat. The rituals extended beyond the temples into bloody spectacles staged before the public. One such event was the gladiator sacrifice. Captured enemies were tied to a stone platform in the center of a large square. They were given a weapon, a macuahuitl, a wooden club lined with dull obsidian edges, and told to defend themselves. Meanwhile, well-trained Aztec warriors, fully armed, attacked them in turn. The outcome was never in doubt. The prisoner's weapon was symbolic, almost theatrical. The real purpose was not to test skill, but to entertain the gods and remind the people of Aztec dominance. When the captive was eventually overwhelmed, he was dragged to the temple and sacrificed in front of cheering crowds. The whole process reinforced the cosmic order. Warriors brought order through war, priests fed the gods through sacrifice, and the people witnessed their empire's divine favor. Some rituals were designed to mimic the creation of the world itself. According to Aztec belief, the gods had suffered terrible wounds to create the cosmos. To honor this divine suffering, sacrificial victims were sometimes dismembered piece by piece. Each limb was removed in a slow, careful process, accompanied by chants and music. Every cut symbolized an aspect of the universe being born: fire, wind, rain, life. The pain and bloodshed were believed to mirror the gods' own agony during the formation of the world. This was not just about death, it was about renewing life. Each dismembered body became a sacred symbol, connecting the everyday world to the cosmic struggle that kept reality in balance. Deep within the mist-covered woodlands of ancient Celtic lands, the forests were not just places of shelter or hunting grounds, they were living altars. The Celts, guided by their priestly class known as the Druids, believed the world pulsed with invisible forces. To keep the land in harmony and please the spirits they revered, they carried out ritual acts of war and sacrifice, unlike anything seen in the classical empires. One of the most feared and unforgettable of these rites was the Wicker Man. This towering structure, shaped like a human and made from branches, vines, and woven sticks, stood as both a spiritual symbol and a horrifying prison. Into its hollow body were shoved captives, sometimes criminals, other times prisoners of war, who were sacrificed to renew the earth. When the giant effigy was set ablaze, the screams of the dying were believed to rise with the smoke into the sky where the gods could hear them. The Druids claimed this fire cleansed the soil, ensuring fertility and prosperity for the tribe. This was not senseless cruelty in their eyes, it was cosmic maintenance, a necessary offering to unseen forces that controlled life and death. The Celts did not just seek victory over their enemies, they sought their spirits. In battle, warriors would aim not only to kill, but to decapitate their foes. The human head was believed to house the soul, making it a sacred object of immense power. After combat, victors carried severed heads home, not with shame but with pride, displaying them on spears or nailing them above doorways. These heads were not trophies in the modern sense. They were seen as spiritual guardians, symbols of strength, and even sources of ancestral protection. In tribal homes and communal spaces, shrines would include skulls of enemies, believed to bring luck and to ward off evil. Sometimes the heads were ritually cleaned, adorned, and even embalmed with cedar oil or resin to preserve them as lasting totems of honor. Loyalty among Celtic warriors was not declared with mere words. When a blood oath was taken, it was sealed with flesh. One of the most intimate and extreme forms of bond-making involved cutting the tongue, a symbol of voice and truth. By slicing their tongues and letting the blood flow, warriors demonstrated they would never betray a vow, even if it cost them their voice. The blood was often mixed into a shared vessel from which participants would drink. This ritual, painful and raw, fused brotherhood with the spirit world. The tongue was more than muscle. It was identity, speech, and promise. To cut it for loyalty was to offer part of the soul itself. Beyond sacrifice and blood oaths, the Druids practiced magical warfare through symbols and curses. They carved Ogham, an ancient alphabet made of slashes and lines, into standing stones. These curse stones were inscribed with dark intentions, naming enemies and binding them to misfortune. Often, bones of the intended victim or their allies were buried nearby, amplifying the magic with remnants of the body. Alongside these stones, ritual rattles made of bones were shaken during ceremonies. The sound was not merely to frighten, but to stir the spirits. Rattling the dead's remains called forth the other world's attention, reinforcing the curse's potency. To a druid, every object held meaning, and even a buried bone could become a weapon. Within the sacred groves, some of the darkest rites occurred under the hanging branches of ancient trees. Captives were brought before these towering witnesses of time and strung up by their necks. But these were not silent executions. As the victims gasped and choked, druids circled the trees, chanting deep, guttural songs. These ritual dirges, often sung in rhythms older than memory, were believed to open the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead. The tree itself acted as a conduit, feeding the dying soul into the spirit realm. Each note carried intention, pain, reverence, balance. The forest echoed with sorrow, fear, and power, reminding all who listened that even death could serve the land. Across the once mighty but now often overlooked African empires, ritual and power merged into acts that the modern world would struggle to comprehend. In the Kingdom of Benin, deep within the sacred compounds of the royal palace, human sacrifice was not just symbolic, it was functional, a spiritual necessity. At key moments, such as the coronation of a new Oba, king, or the outbreak of disease believed to be caused by angry spirits, victims were selected and cast into wide earthen pits, dug for this very purpose. These sacrifice pits were not hidden or secret. They were central parts of the court's ritual architecture, visible reminders that the spiritual and political worlds were inseparable. The lives thrown into these trenches were thought to carry prayers and appeasement to ancestral spirits. In times of plague, the belief was that angry ancestors had been offended and blood offerings would cool their wrath. The more people sacrificed, the more serious the problem, and the more powerful the message sent into the spirit world. In the forests of the Ashanti Empire, music and war were intertwined in ways both majestic and macabre. When warriors returned from battle, their songs of triumph were not always played on wooden drums or animal skins. In some ceremonies, the drums were formed from the skulls of slain enemies. The bones were carefully cleaned, treated, and bound with leather, turned into percussion instruments that quite literally sang the praises of conquest. These skull drums were not mass-produced war trophies, but sacred tools, reserved for elite warriors and religious ceremonies. To beat the skull of an enemy was to silence him forever, to claim not only his body, but his spirit. Each beat echoed through the village, a rhythm of pride and warning. It told the people that their warriors were strong, and told their enemies what fate awaited those who dared to oppose them. In Dahomey, now part of modern-day Benin, the royal compound held within it a single tree that stood as a monument to death. This was the execution tree, a place where thousands were decapitated as part of the kingdom's justice and religious systems. Its bark was darkened by blood, and its roots were said to drink the power of the slain. Often, these executions happened in front of large audiences, timed with royal festivals or public judgments. The tree did not just serve as a gallows, it was seen as a sacred bridge between the living and the ancestors. When a sword met a neck beneath its branches, it wasn't just punishment, it was a passage. The Dahomey believed that the spirit of the dead traveled through the tree into the afterlife, and the sheer number of deaths beneath it made the tree itself a kind of living altar, pulsing with ancestral energy and royal authority. In the Congo Kingdom, spiritual warfare was fought not only on battlefields, but through ritual symbols, most notably the nail fetish figures, wooden effigies known as nkandi. These were humanoid statues into which nails, blades, or spikes were driven to activate their spiritual power. But not all nails were random. In some cases, each hammered spike represented a targeted individual, someone whose fate had already been decided. The figure became a living contract, a magical execution list. Once the nail was struck in, the victim was considered already dead in the eyes of the spirit world. The physical act of killing them later was simply following through on spiritual justice already agreed upon. These statues, kept by priests and chiefs, were feared throughout the land, as they blurred the line between ritual and murder, faith and fatal certainty. Among certain warrior groups in Central and West Africa, cannibal rituals were performed with a purpose far beyond hunger or terror. When an enemy was killed in battle, it was not always enough to simply defeat them physically. In some deeply ritualized traditions, the heart of a slain foe was removed and consumed, not in chaos, but with ceremony. The act was believed to transfer strength, courage, and spiritual essence from the defeated to the victor. Eating the heart was the ultimate way of obliterating a lineage, ensuring that the enemy's power would never return through sons or brothers. It was not done to everyone, but to those considered dangerous, gifted, or symbolically powerful. In this brutal exchange, the eater did not just gain strength. They inherited a spirit, forged anew within their own body.